I can't stress this enough. It's about the issue. It's not about the party. And, while I won't mention names because I would never betray a legislator's trust, I can tell you a couple of our biggest allies right now on this issue, I believe, are actually Democrats that serve in the House of Representatives. But on the flip side, I can't tell you how many, Republicans that you would think would be, oh yeah, this is an easy issue for them. They're conservative. They got a conservative voting record. Who, when you first bring this up, their first question is, well, Tom, you're just talking about a registry. What does it matter? Now, once you have that conversation, they understand it. But again, assume nothing in this business. Never assume that somebody is not going to be an ally, and never assume that somebody is. Get out there and educate these legislators in a very respectful way.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Tom Leonard. He's a former representative and Speaker of the House in the great state of Michigan, and he's here to talk to us today about some new legislation that's being proposed in Michigan. But before we get to that, Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. It is an honor to be here. So, as you mentioned, I served in the legislature here in Michigan. My last term as House Speaker. Before that, I was a prosecutor in Flint. That's where I started after law school. From there, went to the Attorney General's office, and then was approached to run for the state house, and won my first election in 2012. Was very close. We simply outworked our opponent and won by 200. I think it was 212 votes, if I'm not mistaken. And then my last term served as Speaker of the House. From there, after I termed out, President Trump nominated me to be the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Michigan. And unfortunately, after about a year of vetting and everything getting teed up for the Senate, got caught up in politics. Our two home state senators decided to block the nomination in 2019. And a couple months after that fell through, a law firm by the name of Plunkett Cooney reached out to me. We've got about 120 attorneys here. They were looking for an attorney that could build out a government relations practice for them. And about 5 years ago, became a partner here, started our government relations practice, and have been here since. So it's been a wonderful experience. But most importantly, my lovely bride, who's a homeschooler herself, we were married in 2010. We've got 3 beautiful children, and our youngest, Danny, was just born 3 months ago, and has been the best of the 3 in terms of sleeping and being behaved. The last couple of weeks, he slept through the night every day. So I'm blessed.
So you mentioned that you started a government relations practice. What does that mean exactly?
So, a government relations practice, that is a practice they interface with the legislature here in Michigan. So that's what I do. So having been Speaker of the House, had built a lot of relationships, but most importantly, really understand the politics and how to navigate the system here in Lansing. So, there's several law firms throughout the state, and in Plunkett, the one that I'm at now, was one of the few that didn't have this government relations practice. So while I am an attorney, I'm somebody that really tries to focus on resolving or solving problems on the front end before they have to get tied up in litigation. So, for instance, if there's homeschool legislation or something that would burden the homeschool community here, or a parent's right to choose how best to educate their child, I'm somebody that would try to work with this and work on this issue with the legislature on the front end and stop a bad bill from ever becoming law before it becomes law, and then we got to go to court to try to resolve it.
Now, before we started the live conversation in the green room, as it were, you said that the homeschool community really turned out from you or for you in that really close race back in 2012. Tell us about that. What about the homeschoolers in your district, and how have you come to appreciate homeschoolers generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, my wife Janelle and her entire family, she comes from a family of seven. The entire family, they were homeschooled, and certainly something that means, a lot to me, and not just homeschooling, just parental choice in general. I truly believe that a parent knows what's best for their child and how best to educate them. So when I ran for office in 2012, I had a few friends in the district that were homeschooled and were very involved in the homeschool community, and got to know several of those individuals. And they knew how near and dear this was to my heart. So when I ran for office, they were some of my best volunteers. And I will tell you, some of the hardest workers I've ever met. There were 5 or 6 young teenagers, 15, 16 years old. And I can't even count the number of doors. It had to have been in the thousands of doors that they hit for me on that campaign. And again, having a very close election that year, just over 200 votes, there's no doubt that it made the difference.
So fast forward to today, there's some activity in the Michigan legislature. Maybe that's too strong, but there's anticipated activity in the Michigan legislature coming up. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so thankfully we have not seen the activity yet. So let me rewind back, and that's how I became involved in this process, if you will. So what had happened was earlier this year, so this would have been in early January of 24, I believe it was, the superintendent here in Michigan, the state superintendent, sent out this letter of reforms that he felt the legislature needed to tackle. And in that letter, one of these reforms was essentially mandating a homeschool registry, so that every single homeschool family had to register their students or their children onto this state registry. And that was when I started having individuals in the homeschool community. They started reaching out saying, "Hey, we can't have this. What do we got to do to stop this?" So I immediately started working for the group. And what I did is I just started taking meetings with legislators right out of the gate, even before even though legislation had not been introduced. I started meeting with these legislators, explaining to them the significance of homeschooling, the significance of parental choice, and why I felt this was a bad idea. And what I can say is, over the past 10, 11 months, and not just my work, but most importantly, the hard work of many of the homeschool families here in the state of Michigan, thankfully, we have still yet to see a bill be introduced, despite the fact one was going to be imminent just a few months ago.
So working with homeschool families, and how do you what advice do you give to them when they're approaching a legislator?
Yeah. So the number one piece of advice that I give families is that these legislators, just like everybody else, they're human. Okay. They have emotions just like everybody else. So what I tell them is, number one, you have to engage them, but when you do it, it's got to be in a respectful manner. So what I encourage most of the homeschool families to do, and they did this, they engaged, and I have no doubt this is the reason we have been able to stop this bill from being introduced, or I guess prevent it from being introduced, is we engaged them, and hundreds of families throughout the state started to show up to legislative coffee hours. And I told them, I said, listen, you can have a Capitol Day. You can come down here with hundreds of homeschool families, which I think is a good thing, and I would never discourage it. But the most effective thing is when you show up in that legislator's district, when you show up to their coffee hours, their town halls, and they know that you care enough about the issue to sit there and listen to them and then engage them about the issue. But again, you have to do it respectfully. So there were 4 or 5 legislators from across the state who I would say, I believe, probably were not with us on this issue, that we had homeschool families, they went to their coffee hours, they engaged them, they talked to them. And then within days, those legislators were calling me saying, "Hey, I heard you're working with this group. we'd love to have, we'd love to learn more about this. So again, it's that respectful dialogue in their districts, letting them know that you care about this issue in their district.
So today's world seems to be more difficult to have that kind of respectful dialogue. How are you, helping people or training people or encouraging them to maintain that kind of civil discourse, especially in these times?
Well, most homeschool families in general, that is just their nature. I mean, obviously, you're always going to have exceptions to the rule, but even though homeschool families obviously are some of the most passionate families about their issue, of anybody that you can find, their nature is they are respectful. They're just respectful people. So it hasn't been real difficult. Just when you lay it out, when you explain how best to approach them, they get it. And I can tell you, I have not had one legislator approach me and say, hey, this homeschool family showed up and I can't tell you how rude or how obnoxious they are. I mean, everyone, they've been respectful. They've done it the right way. And again, that has gone a long way to stopping this bill from being introduced. I think there are a lot of legislators who have really, it's awakened them and they've seen not only the importance of this issue, but frankly, I don't think they knew how many homeschool families were in their districts.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Members of the state legislature have a lot of issues that they're dealing with, every legislative season. So how do these issues percolate to the attention of legislators? And when's, right now you're doing preventive work, but what's the timing of involvement as bills progress?
Right. So this particular one, I believe the only reason it became an issue was because the state superintendent issued that letter again earlier this year. Because before that letter went out, this really was not on anybody's radar, at least to the best of my knowledge. I had not heard anything. So it was when that letter went out is when you started to see this problem occur. Now, in terms of timing, right now we're as you know, we're about 3 weeks out. We're taping this October 17th, so we're about 3 weeks out from Election Day. And then in Michigan, after the election, there's going to be about 3 to 4 weeks of what we call lame duck, which means the elections have occurred. There are several legislators that are out the door. Maybe those that lost their election, they're not going to be here in January. So lame duck is sometimes it can be the scariest time in the legislature because you just don't know what's going to happen or what type of deals are going to be cut. While this bill still could logistically be introduced, and when I say this bill, I'm talking about the homeschool registry. While the bill still could be introduced and logistically and legally it still could make it through both chambers and make it to the governor's desk and be signed, what I would say is, as we sit here today, we are in a pretty good spot. We've built a lot of momentum and time is really getting short for those that would want to introduce and push this legislation. So we need to continue to do our work here in the state. We need to continue to engage our legislators. But again, we are in a really good spot right now as we head into the end of the year.
And so the new legislature starts in January.
Yes.
What's the process in Michigan for bills to be introduced at the beginning of a legislative season?
So I mentioned lame duck, and when the legislature adjourns for lame duck, a week or two after that is a date that's known as what we call as sine die. And what sine die essentially means is any bill that was introduced in that legislative session. It doesn't matter if it's in committee, it doesn't matter if it's on the floor and didn't get a vote, it doesn't matter what the bill is. Every single bill that didn't make it to the governor's desk by the date of sine die, every single one of those bills or pieces of legislation, it dies and they have to start over. So if we can make it through lame duck without this becoming an issue, and again, I am cautiously optimistic that is going to happen, then we get into the next legislative term. In early January, the new House will be sworn in. The Senate is sworn in, and then they start everything over again, and it's another 2-year battle. So while I feel very good about where we're at for this legislative term, everything starts over in early January with new legislators, and all it takes is for one to introduce this legislation, and we're back to where we started. So we can't let off the gas. Once we get through lame duck of this year in early January, we've got to start working with our legislators again. We've got to start approaching them, especially the new ones. That when the new ones come in early January that have never experienced any of these issues, people like to call it, drinking water from a fire hose. There are so many things that they've got going on, so it'll be imperative to approach them early and educate them on these issues and explain why this is so important to us, and frankly, why it's bad policy.
Hmm. Well, go into that a little bit. Why do you think it is bad policy?
I think we've got to go back over the years. I mean, when you look at Michigan and you look at our scores and our test scores. So just in the past several weeks, the M-STEP is what we call it here in Michigan, which is standardized testing. And I think one of the big ones that really stood out that was released just a couple weeks ago. I mean, listen to a couple of these statistics. Only 11% of the third graders in the Detroit public school system can read at a proficient level. Over 60% of our third graders statewide cannot read proficiently in the state of Michigan. So you've got a lot of families. I think when people think homeschooling, I think a lot of them think it's for, religious reasons. I don't think a lot of people understand how many hundreds, if not thousands of families are out there who are homeschooling their children, and it has nothing to do with religious reasons or religious concerns. They simply know that their child is going to get the best education at their home being homeschooled. And when you start putting a burden on them, like forcing them to register, that opens the door to bringing the government into their home to tell them how to educate their children. And that's what they left. They don't want that. They want to make certain that they are doing what's best for their children. They understand it. They know what's best for them. So a registry, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many that we're fighting for, is they don't want to have to register with the state. They left that. They're out of the public school system. They're doing what's best for their child. They don't want to bring the government into their home to tell them how they have to educate them.
Yeah, that's a really important point that many homeschoolers, myself included, we started homeschooling our kids for the combination of religious conviction plus just a better opportunity educationally. And as homeschooling's grown, the public schools have not performed well, kind of around the country, in a lot of ways, academically, and just the environment of the public schools for young children today are pretty. It's pretty risky for some kids, a lot of kids. And I think that's a big reason why parents choose to homeschool today. What policies in Michigan are kind of intruding on parents? Is there anything else that you see?
No, right now, this is the big one. Under state law, parents have the right, thankfully, thank God, to educate their children, the way that they deem or they see fit. But my concern is, one, as I mentioned, a parent who has chosen to homeschool their child, the idea that they need to register their child with the state is simply not good policy. But second, where might that go once that as well as I do, it simply will not stop with a registry. Then they're going to continue to push and try to bring in certain government mandates. So right now, the registry is the big one that we have seen. There is a bill that's out there right now that does have some people concerned, and that would be there's a compulsory, I believe it's a compulsory kindergarten bill. Right now, I believe in Michigan, you start your child I think they have to be started by the first grade. There was a compulsory kindergarten bill. Now, legal experts are they're mixed as to whether or not that would or would not impact the homeschool community. I know there's some opposition to that, but right now the big piece of legislation that we are trying to ensure never becomes law, and again, thank God it hasn't been introduced, is the registry here in the state of Michigan.
Earlier you talked about Capital Days. Have you participated in a Michigan Homeschool Capital Day?
So I have personally not. I know that there was one here a couple of weeks ago in Lansing, and unfortunately, I had a conflict and I had to be out of town, so I was not here. But I can tell you there was a lot of chatter, and when I say that, I mean that in a positive sense, not a negative sense. There was a lot of chatter by the number of people that showed up and how passionate they were. So I have no doubt that it was effective. When the homeschool community engages, they don't do it, as you know, they don't do it halfway. They go all in. And I do know that the recent one that was here, it created a lot of chatter, a lot of buzz, which is what we want.
What would you say to families in Michigan who want to get involved? How can they get involved in both the legislative process and in this, effort to prevent bad legislation?
Yeah, so I would say, for those that have been involved, we've got to continue to do what we're doing. And for those that have been on the sidelines, uh, listen, I mean, there's this saying in Lansing for everything. It's not just homeschooling, and that is, if you're not engaged, you're going to be on the menu. And I can't tell you how many, interests, whether they be business interests, social interests, whatever they are, people who this term who have found bad legislation becoming law, and they said, "Wow, I never knew that this was a thing." So I would say, number one, if you're engaged, stay engaged. If you have not engaged yet, they certainly need to. Two, how do you do that? We've mentioned it. We talked about it a little bit earlier, and that is, when I say make this personal, I mean in a positive sense, positive reinforcement, not negative reinforcement. Make certain that you're showing up to your legislators' coffee hours or town hall. Make certain that they can put a face with the name, not just the letter going into the office, not just the phone call. Make sure that they know that you care enough to show up to their coffee hours. I can't tell you how many issues when I was a legislator that got resolved because somebody showed up to my coffee hours. They could have 1,000 people send a letter into my district and it probably wouldn't have an impact. But when that one person would show up, sit down with me, discuss the issue, look me in the eyes, and really, when I say make it personal, make that human touch, it's very effective. And then the last thing I would say is this: never assume that because a legislator is from a certain part of the area or because they're from a certain party that you can't have an impact. I can't tell you the number of legislators from Detroit that are either with us right now on this issue or have been very accessible and open, because again, I went through the reading scores with the Detroit public school system. Only 11% of their third graders can read at a proficient level. There are a lot of these legislators in Detroit right now that are saying, "Hey, we've got to have better options for our children," and who knows better than their parents. So I would say, don't think that you only have to engage rural conservative legislators. Approach all of them. Put that human touch on it and let them know how important this issue is.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. More and more today, there's sort of a stereotypical view of homeschoolers as super religious and very conservative, but more and more today, parents from across the ideological and political spectrum are choosing homeschooling for the reasons you've suggested.
I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you what, a big impact, or something that had a big impact, was COVID. Michigan was one of the last states to actually return our children back to school. And we got so far behind as a state. I think a lot of parents during that time, they woke up and said, "Wow, I've got to have something better for my children. And I can't rely on the government to do it." And again, many families from across the state that had, it's not a religious issue for them. It was just hey, I've got to have a better option for my child, and this is what I'm going to do. So again, don't ever be afraid to approach any legislator on these issues, regardless of party and regardless of what their political persuasion is, because most, what I have found, are willing to listen, and a lot of them can be persuaded when you have this conversation.
Yeah, and I'd say also, I think you're working with the state homeschooling organization there in Michigan, and that's a great way to connect with the broader homeschooling movement. The Michigan Christian Homeschool Network, and we'll put their contact information in the show notes so that listeners can get in touch with them as well, because they have the resources to help you get in touch with your legislator and to keep you up to date on what's actually happening, kind of blow by blow, minute by minute. So I'd urge everyone to go to their website and support their work as well. Are you acquainted with David Coleman?
I am. David is a dear friend of mine. In fact, David is the reason. He was the one that reached out and advised me that the superintendent had issued this letter earlier this year. And he said, Tom, I think we might need to, we may need some help here. So he and I, we met in his office with a couple of the other families from across the state that this is, that care passionately about this. We laid out a plan of action, or a plan of attack, if you will. We've followed that to a T, and again, we're in a really good spot here. Lord willing, we're going to make it through this legislative session without a bill being introduced. That is my hope. I'm cautiously optimistic, but David has been very instrumental with his help and with his effort on this issue.
For those of you who don't know who David Coleman is, he is a Michigan attorney, homeschool dad. He literally wrote the book on homeschooling in Michigan, which I think is still available on Amazon. And he worked with us, HSLDA, back in the 90s, took a case to the Michigan Supreme Court where families were being prosecuted in Michigan as recently as the 90s for homeschooling their kids without being state certified teachers. And Dave, along with our founder, Mike Ferris, took a case all the way to the Supreme Court where families were convicted at the trial level of homeschooling without a license. And in 1993, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional under both the Michigan and federal constitutions, which then led to legislation that opened the door for families to be able to homeschool without fear of prosecution and without all of the burdens. And so Dave, as I've worked with Dave for years on cases that come up from time to time, and it's a really important lesson to remember that the freedoms we have in Michigan and all around the country have not always been the case. We fought for these freedoms, and that's why working to prevent this kind of pendulum swinging back in the wrong direction legislation is so important. We fought hard for these freedoms. Homeschoolers have been successful in the face of a lot of opposition. And as you mentioned, homeschooling became an oasis for many families during the COVID times. A lot of families who probably maybe would never have thought about homeschooling their kids because the public schools were out of business for a couple of years. They found homeschooling, they discovered how good it was for their family, and they've stuck with it. And I think, I don't know this, Tom, but I suspect that some of that is the reason why the public school system is trying to kind of rein it back in, because a lot of kids didn't come back to the public schools after they opened.
And I think that is something that we have to remember and understand just how effective the homeschool engagement can be. I mean, think about this, and just speaking, very straightforward and bluntly about this. I mean, Michigan right now is under full Democrat control for the first time in 40 years. And one of their, when you look at Democrats in the state of Michigan, one group that is probably their biggest supporters is the Michigan Education Association. And there is no group that would want to force students back into the public school buildings more than the MEA. And again, the engagement of just everyday families, homeschool families, most of them, a lot of them don't come from a lot of means. They can't show up and talk to a legislator with a big check or make these big political contributions like the Michigan Education Association can, but they've got passion about their issue. They care. And again, I think that goes to show how effective this can be when you show up to those legislative coffee hours. They're up against the Michigan Education Association, one of the biggest lobbies in town, and yet we have been able to prevent this bill from being introduced. I think that says a lot about this community.
I agree, and I think it's the grassroots effort of many families who sincerely believe in the cause that they're talking to their legislator about, and as you mentioned, the respectful engagement. I
Yes.
mean, kind of the best selling point for homeschool freedom is often homeschool families, and homeschool families. I mean, I'm including their children as well. I've been to many state capitol days around the country, and they have a lot of kids, and the kids are well behaved and respectful. And when I was in Nashville just earlier this year, the families at the end of the Capitol Day program went around and visited the offices of their legislators in the Capitol and distributed homemade cookies to just have a touch to say, hey, we're here, we're homeschoolers, we appreciate you, we care about what you're doing, and remember us when the time comes.
And it goes so far. And as I mentioned, and I can't stress this enough. It's about the issue. It's not about the party. And, while I won't mention names because I would never betray a legislator's trust, I can tell you a couple of our biggest allies right now on this issue, I believe, are actually, Democrats that serve in the House of Representatives. But on the flip side, I can't tell you how many, Republicans that you would think would be, oh yeah, this is an easy issue for them. They're conservative. They got a conservative voting record. Who, when you first bring this up, their first question is, well, Tom, you're just talking about a registry. What does it matter? Now, once you have that conversation, they understand it. But again, assume nothing in this business. Never assume that somebody is not going to be an ally, and never assume that somebody is. Get out there and educate these legislators in a very respectful way.
Well, Tom, I'll give you the last word. Anything you'd like to add?
I think I summed it up pretty well there. I mean, listen, it has been an honor to work with HSLDA, the rest of the homeschool groups across the state of Michigan. This is a team effort. I can sit down, I can lay out the strategy, but I can't be all places at once. And again, if it wasn't for the effort of these everyday families getting out there, doing the work, showing up to these legislative coffee hours, we would not be in the position that we're in right now. So we can't give up. We got to keep doing what we're doing, stay engaged, stay motivated. And I have no doubt if we continue to do that, we will continue to protect homeschool, rights here in the state of Michigan, hopefully for years to come.
Well, thank you for your time today and for your work on behalf of homeschool freedom up there in Michigan. We really appreciate it. Once again, if you would like to plug into the state group up there, go to our show notes for the Michigan Christian Homeschool Network. They're right there in Michigan. They're active, and they can plug you in to do this important work that Tom and I have been talking about. Also, if you are not yet a member of HSLDA, we'd love to have you join us. What we are doing in Michigan, we're also actively engaged all around the country in many state legislatures, as well as helping individual homeschool families who face challenges by the government. You can find out more about us at hslda.org. And whether you're homeschooling or not, if you'd like to support our cause, you can donate to our Homeschool Freedom Fund, and we will use those funds to continue doing this important work of advancing the cause of homeschool freedom all across the country. So thanks again for joining us today.
Today's episode is made possible by HSLDA's Generation Joshua program. Do you have a student who wants to make a difference in our nation? Generation Joshua empowers teens to make the most of their citizenship through local clubs, immersive simulations, online courses, and real-life campaign experiences. For more information, visit generationjoshua.org. That's generationjoshua.org. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.